So picture downtown San Francisco on like a random Tuesday afternoon.
Oh, yeah, you could definitely picture it.
Right. Just hold the sheer scale of what you see in your mind,
Yeah.
the tents, the sleeping bags, just the sheer visibility of the crisis on the sidewalks of a major American city.
It's everywhere.
It is. Now compare that mental image to this. In January of 2025, the government of Japan conducted its national street count.
Which is a massive undertaking.
Huge. Across the entire nation, which is this highly urbanized country of, roughly 124 million people, they officially counted exactly 2,591 people living on the streets.
2,591 people
Yeah.
across an entire industrialized nation. I mean, it's wild. And when you look at the historical context, that figure isn't just like a random low point. It represents a roughly 90% decline from their modern peak.
90%.
Yeah, because back in 2003, Japan's nationwide count recorded over 25,000 people living on the street.
And that contrast is exactly why we are doing this deep dive today. Because you read a headline that says, a developed, dense nation essentially eliminated street homelessness. And your first instinct, definitely my first instinct, is to find out what magic policy they implemented so we can just copy it.
Right, like what's the silver bullet?
Exactly. But as we dug through the research for this deep dive, the picture became so much more complicated. The decline from 25,000 is real. But to understand it, we are going to ask you to look at the space just beyond the edges of the official statistics.
Yeah, we want to find out who is standing just outside the frame of the photograph, basically.
Right. Because the official numbers are fascinating, but they force us to examine the actual mechanics of how a society measures human poverty.
Completely. The decline in Japan is an objective reality, sure.
Mm-hmm.
But the way we measure the end of the line for people experiencing extreme precarity, it might be fundamentally flawed. And our journey through these sources today is going to take you from the neon-lit, silent cubicles of Tokyo's 24-hour internet cafes down to the aging lodging houses of Osaka, and finally, right back to the massive blind spots hiding inside America's own official statistics.
Which is going to blow people's minds, I think. But let's start with that 2003 peak, because it really anchors the whole narrative.
It does.
To understand how they got down to 2,000, I had to look at what pushed the number up to 25,000 in the first place. And the sources all point to the aftermath of Japan's, their lost decade.
Yeah, the 1990s.
Right. But the sheer scale of the economic destruction for a very specific demographic is just wild to read about.
It was devastating.
So in the early 1990s, Japan's massive asset bubble burst, and it specifically decimated the older male day laborer population.
And, the structural reliance on male day laborers in post-war Japan is a piece of economic history that honestly just gets overlooked so often.
I didn't know much about it before this.
Well, during the rapid economic growth of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Japan was building infrastructure at just a blistering pace.
Like highways, buildings, everything.
Everything. And the system relied on an army of low-skilled, highly flexible male workers. They didn't have lifetime employment contracts with major corporations like, Toyota or Sony.
But they weren't salarymen.
Not at all.
Yeah.
They were hired by the day,
Yeah.
paid in cash, and basically used to fuel the construction boom. So when the Bank of Japan raised interest rates at the end of the 80s to cool off those absurdly inflated real estate prices, the bubble didn't just deflate. It exploded.
Right. Credit basically froze entirely.
Overnight, construction projects just halted. The men who literally built the physical infrastructure of modern Japan by the day were suddenly showing up to hiring halls where there was absolutely no work.
And no safety net, right?
Exactly. Because they had no formal corporate safety net, no severance, and honestly, often no family ties. Since many had migrated from rural areas decades prior, they were pushed directly onto the streets. That is what created the very visible tented encampments in the parks, on the riverbanks, and in the train stations of big cities like Tokyo and Osaka, which all culminated in that 2003 crisis peak.
Okay, so we have this very visible crisis of 25,000 people outdoors. And now, 20 years later, they are down by 90%.
Right.
Which brings us to the actual methodology of the official photograph we were talking about. Because to understand how a country achieves an official number of just 2,591, I started looking into mechanically exactly what the Japanese Ministry of Health labor and welfare is measuring.
And it's surprisingly straightforward.
It is a highly physical, literal operation. Like, it's completely analog.
Totally. So on a single day in January, which is intentionally chosen in the dead of winter, by the way.
It's brutal.
Yeah, very deliberate.
Yeah.
But government workers and local officials physically fan out across the country. They literally walk the parks, they patrol the riverbanks, they inspect the train stations and underpasses.
With, like, clipboards.
Clipboards and clickers. They systematically tally individuals who are visibly sleeping rough.
See, I found myself genuinely impressed by the thoroughness of it, but also, immediately suspicious of the limitations.
Oh, for sure.
Now, we absolutely have to acknowledge the real victories here. The government didn't just do nothing after 2003. They expanded welfare outreach. And frankly, Japan has a rapidly aging population, meaning the pool of young people falling into this specific kind of absolute outdoor poverty is just smaller.
That demographic shift is huge.
But reading the methodology, the operative word in the entire manual is outdoors.
Yes. That is the definitional boundary of the Japanese government survey, the physical door of a building.
Right.
By design, the methodology only captures those who are visible outside, on public property. So if an individual is sleeping in a car, they are excluded from the count.
Wait, even in a car?
Even in a car. If they're sleeping on a friend's floor because they were evicted, they are excluded. And crucially, for our understanding of modern precarity, if someone is sitting behind a closed private door, even if that door is rented by the hour, they are entirely excluded from the official definition of being homeless.
Okay, so my immediate reaction to reading that was, frankly, pretty cynical. It feels like a very convenient statistical loophole.
It does sound like one.
You define homelessness so narrowly that the problem legally ceases to exist the exact moment someone steps under a commercial roof. Is it just a massive cover-up by the Japanese government to project societal perfection?
It is a totally understandable reaction, but calling it a cover-up kind of misunderstands how administrative data actually works.
How so?
Well, the Japanese government is entirely transparent about what this survey measures. It is an honest, accurate tally of people sleeping outside on a given day.
Yeah.
There is no statistical trickery involved in the execution itself.
Okay, fair.
The problem really arises in the translation of that data to the public, and honestly, to the rest of the world. Because when a headline broadcasts homelessness in Japan hits record low, the average reader assumes homelessness means people without a permanent secure residence.
Right, because the general public conflates rooflessness with homelessness. We assume it means a lack of a permanent address, whereas the government is literally just measuring the absence of a roof on January 15th.
Exactly. This disconnect is what renders international league tables of homelessness so incredibly treacherous. A nation with a very low number isn't necessarily free of housing insecurity. They might just be remarkably efficient at keeping it indoors, out of the public square, and therefore out of the data set.
Which opens up a massive question for anyone trying to understand the reality of this situation. Because if poverty didn't magically vanish in Japan and the unhoused aren't on the riverbanks anymore, where did they go?
Right. Where are they?
And the research points straight toward a population that I just found completely fascinating. They are known as the net-café nanmin, the net-café refugees.
Yeah, moving from the visible outdoor encampments to the indoor informal housing of the internet cafe. It represents a total mutation of how poverty looks in an urban environment.
It really does. When I first saw the phrase internet cafe, I definitely brought all my Western biases to the table.
Oh, I'm sure. What were you picturing?
I pictured a loud, brightly lit room with an espresso machine and rows of desktop computers where teenagers are shouting over video games.
Like a LAN center from the early 2000s?
Exactly. But the sources describe a space that is architecturally and socially alien to that concept. I was reading descriptions of these dark, silent, sprawling floors divided into hundreds of tiny private cubicles.
Yeah, Japan's 24-hour internet and manga cafes evolved into an entirely different architectural space. If you walk into one of these establishments, it feels like a hybrid between a library, a cheap hotel, and honestly, a digital isolation chamber.
A digital isolation chamber. That's dark.
It is. You pay at the front desk for a block of time, perhaps an 8 or 12-hour night pack. Then you are assigned a numbered cubicle. And inside, the space is barely larger than a single tatami mat.
So tiny.
Very tiny. You have a reclining chair or maybe a flat, padded mat. You have a computer monitor, a pair of headphones, and a heavy sliding door.
But the door doesn't fully lock from the outside, right? The sources noted that for fire safety and legal reasons, they aren't technically classified as lodging facilities.
Right.
So the privacy is kind of an illusion maintained by social contract.
That's exactly it. The lack of a lock is the legal distinction that separates a cafe from a hotel, which lets them avoid strict lodging regulations. Yet these facilities have totally adapted to serve the biological needs of survival.
How so?
Well, they provide unlimited soft drinks from a fountain. They have extensive libraries of manga comics.
Right.
But more importantly, many now offer coin-operated showers, laundry machines, and they even sell basic toiletries like razors and underwear right at the front desk.
So it is a self-contained ecosystem for basic survival.
Pretty much.
And it is completely silent. People are just whispering, avoiding eye contact. It is this profound isolation packed into high-density commercial real estate. And for a specific demographic of people, this is a functional, informal bedroom.
It is. Because for less than the price of a traditional capsule hotel, an individual can secure climate-controlled safety, a place to wash their clothes, and a screen to disconnect from their reality.
And the demographics of the net-café refugee completely shatter the stereotype of who is experiencing housing insecurity. Like, we aren't talking about the older day laborers from the 2003 peak anymore.
No, not at all.
We are talking about people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. And what struck me most, many of them are employed.
Yes.
They are gig workers, temp workers, people who have an income, but it is deeply unstable.
The rise of this specific demographic is directly tied to the deregulation of the Japanese labor market in the late 1990s and early 2000s.
Yeah.
To help corporations recover from the lost decade we talked about, the government made it much easier to hire non-regular workers, part-timers, dispatch workers known as heiken, and contract employees.
Just casual labor, basically.
Exactly. And today, nearly 40% of the Japanese workforce falls into this non-regular category. They earn significantly less, they have fewer benefits, and they can be terminated with very little notice.
So you have a massive pool of young adults with precarious incomes. But my immediate thought reading this was, if you have a job, even a part-time one, and you can afford to pay $20 or $30 a night for a cubicle, why not just rent a cheap apartment?
It seems like the logical next step, right?
Yeah. Why submit to living in a windowless box?
Yeah.
But this is where the structural barriers of the Japanese housing market come into really sharp focus. The barrier to entry for traditional housing is incredibly high.
It requires a pristine, conventional economic profile, which non-regular workers inherently lack. I mean, the upfront costs are
It's
just...
totally prohibitive.
Exactly. Beyond the first month's rent and a security deposit, renters often have to pay reiken, or key money, which is a traditional, non-refundable cash gift to the landlord, sometimes equivalent to 1 or 2 months' rent.
A non-refundable gift to the landlord. Wow.
Yep. Furthermore, landlords usually demand proof of stable, full-time employment.
But the hurdle that seems truly insurmountable for this population is the guarantor requirement. I was reading about this, and it just seems like a devastating catch-22.
It is. The guarantor system is arguably the primary driver of this specific hidden population. To sign a lease in Japan, you traditionally need a guarantor.
Which is like a co-signer in the U.S.
Very similar. It's someone, usually a financially stable family member, who legally signs a contract agreeing to pay your rent if you default. But if you are estranged from your family, if your parents have passed away, or if your family is equally impoverished, you cannot provide a guarantor.
So, okay, imagine you are a 30-year-old dispatch worker. You lost a full-time contract, you blew through your savings paying rent while unemployed, and eventually you got evicted.
A very common scenario.
Right. And you pick up a new part-time gig at a convenience store. You have cash in your pocket from your shift, but absolutely no landlord will look at you. You don't have the key money. You don't have the permanent employment contract. And you can't ask your estranged father to co-sign.
You hit an impenetrable administrative wall.
Exactly.
And the internet cafe, by its very nature, bypasses all of those structural bottlenecks. There is no background check. There is no lease agreement. There's absolutely no demand for a guarantor. The only requirement is the cash to cover the next 12 hours.
It is literally shelter measured by the hour. I was trying to conceptualize what the psychological toll of that existence must be. And the closest analogy I could come up with is being indefinitely stuck in a windowless airport lounge.
Oh, that's a really good comparison.
Think about how you feel during a massive flight delay. The lounge has all the amenities of biological survival. It is climate controlled, it's safe from the elements, there are free drinks, bathrooms and chairs you can kind of sleep in. but it is a profoundly transient space. You are fundamentally untethered from society when you are in an airport lounge. You are a customer, not a resident.
And the psychological untethering of that is devastating. Because when you exist in a net cafe, you lack a permanent address. In a heavily bureaucratized society like Japan, lacking an address means you often cannot receive official mail, you cannot register for certain public services,
Oh, wow.
and it becomes exponentially harder to apply for the very full-time jobs that would allow you to escape the cafe in the first place.
It's a trap.
It really creates a self-replicating loop of precarity. You are housed just enough to survive the night, but unhoused enough that you cannot build a foundation for tomorrow.
Which brings us to the data surrounding this population. If they are behind these sliding doors, avoiding the government workers with clipboards in January, how do we actually know the scale of this problem?
It's tough. The statistics in the research are wildly messy, and they reveal the real tension between official definitions and lived reality. The Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare did attempt to quantify this back in 2007.
Because the media was picking up on it.
Right. The term net-café refugee really permeated the public consciousness around that time, which prompted the government to conduct its first national study. And they estimated that there were roughly 5,400 people nationwide living in internet cafes with no permanent address.
5,400, a notable number, but, still relatively small. But then the timeline jumps forward. I was looking at a survey conducted a decade later, in 2017, by the Tokyo Metropolitan Government that wanted a localized picture. And they found that in Tokyo alone, there were an estimated 4,000 people a night who were effectively homeless and sleeping in these internet cafes.
The contrast there is stark. The official street count for the entire country of Japan in 2025 was 2,591. Yet in one single city, a 2017 survey found an invisible population inside the cafes that was significantly larger than the visible street population of the entire nation.
That is the chunk of reality missing from the photograph. But as we dig deeper into the sources, the estimates from media and housing advocacy groups just explode. You see reports suggesting the true number of net cafe refugees is somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 people nationwide.
Which is a huge leap.
How do we process a gap between 4,000 in a major city and 300,000 nationally?
Well, critical analysis is essential when looking at those higher estimates. The figures of 100,000 to 300,000 are not censuses, they are broad extrapolations. Advocacy groups often base these numbers on overall cafe usage rates and broader economic indicators of gig worker poverty.
Okay, so it's an educated guess.
Yes. However, skeptics rightfully point out a major economic flaw in assuming 300,000 people are living this way permanently.
Because the math of living in a cafe doesn't actually pencil out as a long-term economic strategy.
Precisely. Renting a cubicle night after night, even with discounted nighttime packs, is financially draining. Living in a cafe for 30 consecutive days can end up costing roughly the same amount as renting a cheap apartment in the suburbs.
Wait, really? The same amount?
Yeah, often it's comparable. The idea that hundreds of thousands of people are sustaining that specific, inefficient, hourly financial drain indefinitely is highly contested by economists.
That makes perfect sense, because if you have the consistent monthly cash flow to survive in a cafe for a year, you technically have the cash flow for rent. You were just locked out by the structural barriers we talked about, the key money, the guarantor.
Exactly.
So the 300,000 figure might be an overstatement of chronic cafe dwellers, but it likely accurately represents the pool of people who cycle in and out of them during periods of acute crisis.
I think that's the fairest way to look at it. Regardless of the exact digit, the shape of the phenomenon is undeniable. There's a large hidden population navigating daily life in a private, 24-hour cubicle, completely invisible to the official winter street count.
It highlights a massive demographic shift. The net cafes serve as the informal safety net for the younger, intermittently employed generation.
They really do.
But if we trace the timeline logically, a massive question emerges. We know the 2003 peak of 25,000 was mostly older men, the former day laborers from the lost decade.
Right.
Those men didn't suddenly get young, learn to navigate digital spaces, and move into internet cafes.
No, definitely not.
So where did the men from the 2003 peak go?
To find the older generation, we have to shift our focus completely away from the modern, temporary fix of the neon-lit cafe and examine the historical, institutionalized housing of Japan's post-war era. We have to look at the graying of the doya-gai.
The doya-gai, yeah. The research on these districts is like stepping into a time capsule. These are the day labor or lodging house districts.
Yes.
The three most famous ones historically were Sanya in Tokyo, Kotobukicho in Yokohama, and Kamagasaki, which is often referred to as the Aaron District in Osaka.
And to really understand what these districts are today, you must understand what they were designed to be in the 60s and 70s. They were intentionally constructed as massive labor reservoirs.
Like purpose-built.
Exactly. The Japanese state and corporate sectors needed a centralized location to house and manage the highly mobile, flexible male workforce required for rapid industrial expansion. They were filled with doya.
Which is slang, right?
Yeah, it's a slang term derived from reversing the word yado, meaning inn. A doya is basically a cheap, single-room lodging house.
The descriptions of the morning hiring halls in places like Kamagasaki during the boom years paint a picture of just chaotic, physical, cash-in-hand economies.
Oh, it was intense. At 4 or 5 in the morning, the streets would be teeming with thousands of men. Labor brokers, sometimes affiliated with organized crime syndicates like the Yakuza.
Wait, really? The Yakuza?
Oh yeah, they were heavily involved in labor brokering. They would arrive in vans. They would select the men they needed for the day, drive them to construction sites or the docks, and pay them in cash at the end of the shift. The men would then use that cash to rent a doya room for the night, eat and drink. It was an ecosystem built entirely on the premise of endless physical labor.
But the asset bubble burst, the construction boom ended, and the daily jobs evaporated, which fueled the 2003 street homelessness crisis that we saw. But if I were to walk through Kotobukicho today, I'm not going to see an army of young men looking for scaffolding work.
No, you won't. The demographic reality has fundamentally shifted. The men who were in their 50s during the 2003 crisis are now in their 70s and 80s. The population of these districts has grayed significantly, and they are no longer sleeping on the streets.
So what happened?
In response to the crisis, local governments and welfare agencies heavily targeted these historical districts with public assistance outreach. Today, places like Kotobukicho are largely populated by men over 65, living entirely on state welfare, renting the exact same tiny 3-tatami mat doya rooms they used to rent when they were pouring concrete.
Wow. From a purely bureaucratic administrative standpoint, that is a massive success story. The government intervened, provided funds, and got 20,000 men off the pavement and under a roof. They are housed.
Bureaucratically, yes, they are housed, and therefore they are completely removed from the national street count. But engaging deeply with the source material forces us to confront a profound philosophical question about the nature of housing and poverty.
Right.
Because these men represent a highly concentrated, rapidly aging, and deeply isolated population. They are living out their final years in fading districts that the rest of the city actively avoids.
I want to challenge this narrative slightly just to test the logic here.
Correct.
If they have a room, a door that locks, and basic income for food and heat, aren't they technically housed? Like, why do sociologists and housing advocates still consider them part of the hidden homeless or precarious narrative? If the goal was to get them off the street, mission accomplished, right?
Well, it forces us to define what a home actually is. Is a home simply a physical container that prevents you from freezing to death? Or does the concept of housing require integration, community, and dignity? The doya-gai have effectively transformed from vibrant, albeit gritty, labor hubs into massive, open-air nursing homes for destitute men. They are intensely isolated.
Basically just sweeping the problem into a designated corner.
Exactly. When a society concentrates poverty, isolating an entire demographic of formerly homeless men into a historical district, is that a genuine resolution to the crisis of homelessness? Or is it simply a quieter, more invisible form of the exact same marginalization?
That makes a lot of sense.
They are managed, they are indoors, but they remain profoundly hidden from the mainstream public consciousness.
It is a striking contrast. You have the young gig workers hidden in the fragmented isolation of internet cafes across the city, and you have the aging laborers concentrated in the historical isolation of the doya-gai. But this raises a glaring contradiction in the narrative for me.
What's that?
Well, the older men in the doya-gai are surviving because they are receiving public welfare. The government is paying for their rooms. Why aren't the young people in the net cafes doing the exact same thing? If Japan has a safety net capable of getting older men off the streets, why isn't it catching the gig workers?
And that contradiction is the core tragedy of the Japanese welfare system. For the vast majority of Japan's hidden homeless, whether in cafes or couch surfing, public assistance remains entirely out of reach. And crucially, it is not because the government lacks the financial resources.
And then what is it?
It is because of a massive, almost impenetrable cultural and bureaucratic wall designed to deter applicants.
The system itself is known as Seikatsu Hogo, correct?
Yes, Seikatsu Hogo, which translates to Livelihood protection. On paper, the Japanese constitution guarantees the right to a minimum standard of wholesome and cultured living. Seikatsu Hogo is the mechanism for that guarantee.
Right.
It is an incredibly robust, comprehensive safety net. If approved, it provides cash for daily living costs, covers housing rent up to a certain limit, and completely subsidizes medical care. Theoretically, it is a system perfectly designed to catch a young worker who loses their apartment and ends up in a cafe.
Or the people who are couch surfing. Because we haven't even really touched on that demographic, but the sources imply it is massive.
Couchsurfing is the ultimate invisible safety net. Strong family structures and social norms in Japan absorb an unknown, but likely huge number of people who would otherwise face street homelessness.
Like adult children returning to their parents' homes after losing a job, or siblings quietly taking someone in.
Exactly. It hides severe housing precarity inside private residential homes, far away from any clipboard-carrying government worker.
But when that family net phrase, or for the people in the net cafes who don't have that family net to rely on, they desperately need Seikatsu Hogo. Yet the take-up rate, the percentage of eligible people who actually apply and receive it, is staggeringly low. Why?
The low take-up rate is driven by two distinct interlocking barriers, one bureaucratic and one deeply cultural. Let's examine the bureaucratic rule first. To qualify for welfare in Japan, applicants must pass what is known as the Family Support Inquiry.
The family support inquiry.
Yeah, the state requires proof that your relatives are completely incapable of supporting you before public funds are dispersed.
How does that actually function in the real world? It sounds like standard bureaucratic paperwork, but the sources describe it as deeply traumatic.
It is an active, aggressive investigation. When an individual applies for assistance, the welfare office will trace their family tree. The government will send official letters or make direct phone calls to the applicant's parents, their siblings, and sometimes even their adult children or more distant relatives.
Oh, wow.
The inquiry explicitly informs the family that their relative is destitute, applying for public funds, and asks, are you financially capable of taking this person in or supporting them to prevent them from becoming a burden on the state?
See, I want to frame this for you, the listener, so you can really feel the psychological weight of this rule. Imagine you are 29 years old, you lost your job, your relationship fell apart, you got evicted, and you have been sleeping in an internet cafe for 3 weeks.
Total crisis.
You are exhausted, you're skipping meals, and you finally swallow your pride and go to a municipal office to ask for help. Imagine if a hospital refused to put a cast on your broken arm until they successfully mailed a certified letter to your estranged mother, informing her that you have failed at life and asking if she will pay for the cast.
It's brutal. But the humiliation of that process is the point. The bureaucratic mechanism is weaponized by the cultural context. Japan places a massive societal premium on the concept of meiwaku, the imperative to avoid causing trouble or being a burden to others, especially the broader community or the state.
Most people would rather just walk around with a broken arm. They would rather sleep in a tiny cafe cubicle than have that letter arrive at their successful brother's house.
Tens of thousands of people make exactly that choice. They choose the grueling reality of the cafe over the social death of the family inquiry. This cultural shame runs incredibly deep. Sociological studies indicate that needing the government to pay for your survival is often internalized as a fundamental failure of civic duty, and particularly for men, a failure of manhood.
And the application process itself is described by advocates as deliberately hostile.
Oh, absolutely. There are widely documented cases of what advocates call mizugiwa sakuzen, or border control operations at welfare offices. Caseworkers instructed to keep budgets down actively turn people away at the counter.
They just tell them no.
They discourage applicants by playing on this exact shame, reminding them of the heavy burden they're attempting to place on taxpayers or the embarrassment they will cause their families.
So the safety net exists, and it is fully funded, but the mesh of the net is basically electrified. You have to endure intense social humiliation to get through it. As a result, the hidden homeless don't apply. They remain unhoused, they stay off the welfare rolls, they hide behind cafe doors, and they never, ever show up in the January street count.
Exactly. The system functions perfectly to keep the official numbers low by ensuring the most vulnerable remain invisible.
Now, At this point in the research, it is incredibly easy to look at the family inquiry rule, the concept of meiwaku, and this intense culture of shame, and categorize it as a uniquely Japanese phenomenon.
It's tempting to do that.
It is. We can sit back and say, oh, look at how this specific exotic cultural trait creates a statistical blind spot. But if we widen the lens and look fairly at the data, the core issue, officially ignoring massive segments of the hidden homeless, is not uniquely Japanese at all. The United States executes the exact same statistical maneuver on a massive scale.
This is the crucial pivot here.
Mm-hmm.
Japan is not an exotic outlier. It is a crystal clear mirror for how American administrative systems function.
Because the definitional tricks that keep the net-café workers out of the Japanese statistics are perfectly mirrored in how the U.S. government counts its own population. How does the United States officially measure homelessness?
The American equivalent of Japan's Winter Street Survey is conducted by HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It is known as the point-in-time count, or the PIT count.
And mechanically, how is the point-in-time count executed?
It is structurally identical to the Japanese model. On a single night, usually in late January, thousands of volunteers and outreach workers across the country tally individuals.
Sounds familiar.
Very. They count people who are residing in official emergency shelters, transitional housing, or who are slipping in places not meant for human habitation. So sidewalks, parks, underpasses, and cars.
Okay, so if I am sleeping in a tent in San Francisco, HUD counts me. If I am in an official city-funded shelter in New York, HUD counts me. But what if my family is evicted, and my 2 kids and I are sleeping on the floor of my sister's 1-bedroom apartment? Or what if we pooled our last bit of cash and are paying for a cheap motel room by the week?
According to the HUD point-in-time count, you are not officially homeless. You fall completely outside the definitional boundary. Just like the net-café refugees in Japan who are technically indoors, if you are crammed into a motel or sleeping on a relative's floor in the United States, HUD's methodology renders you invisible.
But surely the U.S. government knows these families exist. They haven't just vanished into the ether.
The federal government is entirely aware of them, but the acknowledgement depends entirely on which department you ask. This is where the American system reveals its own internal contradictions.
They'll be late on me.
While HUD uses a very narrow shelter and street definition, the U.S. Department of Education uses a significantly broader, more realistic definition of homelessness for students.
Why does the Department of Education even have its own definition of homelessness? Like, what is the political mechanism driving that?
It is driven by a piece of federal legislation called the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. The mandate of the Department of Education is fundamentally different from HUD. HUD is concerned with allocating funds for physical shelter beds and housing units.
Right.
The Department of Education is mandated to ensure that children do not drop out of school due to housing instability. Under McKinney-Vento, schools are legally required to identify homeless students to provide them with transportation, free meals, and enrollment protections.
So they have to cast a wider net.
Exactly. Because their goal is educational continuity, they recognize that a child sleeping on a cousin's floor or bouncing between cheap motels is experiencing severe trauma and instability. They categorize this hidden population as being doubled up.
Doubled up, meaning multiple families or individuals crammed into a single dwelling purely for economic reasons because they have nowhere else to go.
Precisely. The Department of Education's definition explicitly includes these doubled-up families, youth sleeping in motels, and couch surfers.
Okay, so we have 2 massive federal agencies using entirely different definitions to describe the exact same crisis. What is the actual numerical gap between HUD's reality and the Department of Education's reality?
The gap isn't a slight discrepancy. It is a chasm.
How big?
HUD's point-in-time count consistently reports a lower number of total homeless individuals nationwide, usually hovering around 500,000 to 600,000 people. That is the figure that makes the evening news. But the Department of Education, measuring only students enrolled in public schools, consistently records well over 1 million homeless children and youth in a single school year.
Over 1 million students alone.
Yes.
And that doesn't even count their parents or single adults or infants not yet in school.
Exactly. And the vast majority of those million-plus students are not in shelters, and they are not on the street. They are doubled up. They are hidden inside residential homes and motels, completely mirroring the family-absorbed and cafe-dwelling populations in Japan.
Wow. I want to introduce a new way to think about this gap. Imagine the dashboard of your car. HUD is a warning light that only turns on when the engine is literally on fire and flames are shooting out of the hood. That is visible street homelessness.
That's a great way to put it.
And the Department of Education is the warning light that turns on when the oil pressure drops to dangerous levels. It catches the hidden internal damage before the engine blows. But when a politician stands up at a podium in the U.S., or a mayor holds a press conference to claim homelessness in our city is down 5%, which warning light are they actually quoting?
Almost without exception, elected officials quote the HUD point-in-time count. They quote it because it is the lowest available number, it is the standard metric used to claim success, and it is the baseline for federal funding allocation.
They are quoting the metric that willfully ignores the doubled-up families.
They are. Advocacy groups, like Schoolhouse Connection, have spent years fighting this exact discrepancy. They argue that the PIT count grossly and systematically undercounts children, youth, and families. Because the reality of poverty dictates that a mother with 2 kids who gets evicted is going to do everything in her physical power to avoid sleeping on the literal street.
Of course.
She will sleep in her car or squeeze into her sister's living room to protect her children from the foster care system and the dangers of the street.
Just like a young gig worker in Tokyo will do everything in his power to avoid the freezing riverbank and the shame of the family inquiry, so he pays for the internet cafe cubicle.
The mechanism of human survival is identical across cultures. People in acute crisis will always seek out the safest, most private alternative available to them, however inadequate it may be.
It's just human nature.
Right. And in both Japan and the United States, the headline government metric is explicitly designed to stop looking exactly where those desperate people go. The American headline number and the Japanese headline number share the exact same architectural blind spot.
The synthesis of everything we have explored today, from the silent internet cafes of Tokyo to the crowded motel rooms of America, leads to a massive realization about how we consume data. It's really the universal truth about how society defines a crisis.
And the universal lesson here is that an official statistic, no matter how authoritative the source, is rarely a pure, unvarnished fact of nature. It is not an objective truth handed down from on high. It is simply the administrative answer to a prior, highly subjective question. Whom did we decide to count?
And more importantly, whom did we decide not to see?
Exactly. Japan drew an administrative line at the outdoors and arrived at 2,591. HUD draws a line at official shelters and streets and gets one number, while the Department of Education draws the line wider, including the doubled up, and reveals a vastly larger crisis.
And if you look at progressive housing systems like Finland, they explicitly include doubled up and hidden homeless populations in their primary national figures.
Which means reading a headline comparing international rates of homelessness is basically useless if you don't read the fine print. International comparisons are incredibly treacherous. When you look at a global league table, you are rarely comparing apples to apples. You are comparing different definitions of reality. A country that looks terrible in the rankings might simply be rigorously honest about counting its hidden populations.
While a country that looks like a utopian success story might just have a remarkably narrow definition of what qualifies as a crisis.
Exactly.
This brings me to why you, the listener, should care about this deep dive. This isn't just an abstract sociological critique of foreign policies. This is about how you consume information in the real world every single day.
It applies to everything.
When you are reading a news article, scrolling through your feed, or even sitting in a boardroom looking at corporate data, how should you process a remarkably low statistic? What is the honest, intellectually rigorous way to engage with a number that seems almost too good to be true, like Japan's 90% drop?
Well, the intellectually rigorous move is not to default to complete cynicism. We shouldn't call every official statistic a lie. As we established, Japan's count isn't a lie. There genuinely are fewer people freezing on the riverbanks, and that is a good thing.
Right.
But a low number can mean two very different things simultaneously. It can mean a society has genuinely solved a problem, or it can mean the boundaries of the count are drawn so narrowly that the bulk of the suffering simply falls outside the frame. In both Japan and the United States, the reality is a complex mix of both.
So the discipline you need to develop, the critical thinking muscle you need to train, is to immediately ask the follow-up question. The very moment someone hands you a polished statistic or a definitive chart, you must ask, what are the exact parameters of this number, and exactly who does it leave out?
If you fail to ask who is left out, you are passively accepting someone else's definition of reality without questioning their motives or their methodology.
It has been an incredibly illuminating journey today. We started with an astonishingly low number, just 2,591 people officially living on the streets of Japan.
A tiny fraction of what it used to be.
We followed the trail of the invisible to the neon glow of the net cafes, where precarious gig workers navigate daily life in private, 24-hour cubicles just to survive the night. We explored the history of the graying doya-gai, looking at the aging day laborers warehoused in tiny rooms, questioning if managing poverty is the same as solving it.
It rarely is.
And we examined the massive invisible wall of family inquiry rules and cultural shame that actively prevents desperate citizens from utilizing public safety nets.
And we brought it all the way across the ocean to reveal the exact same structural blind spot in the United States, where our official HUD counts look right past the doubled-up homeless students recognized by our own schools.
It all comes back to that photograph we talked about at the very beginning of this deep dive. The camera is pointed squarely at the park bench, while the real story, the massive hidden weight of modern precarity, is happening behind the closed doors just out of frame.
Well said.
And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over today. If a government's defining metric for a housing crisis relies entirely on whether a person is visibly sleeping on public property, then we have to ask ourselves, are our civic solutions actually designed to solve the human need for a secure home? Or are they just designed to fix the visual aesthetics of our city so the rest of us don't have to look at the problem? Think about who is standing just outside your frame. Stay insanely curious, keep asking the hard questions, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.